Foundation for their support and perspectives open to general public and free of charge the second year, for their commitment to ongoing scholarship in the field of Jewish law. We also recognize and thank the full-time students of the Aliyah, who enter this space on a daily basis and help make it a place of serious core learning that is open to the broader community. Part of the Aliyah's mission is to address contemporary customs through serious engagement with Jewish practice. We are thrilled you are here tonight joining us in person for the launch of this series, and we also welcome our many viewers watching online through YouTube. For those viewers watching online, you may download the course onto our website. The format this evening will feature a 60-minute formal lecture followed by a question period of half an hour. It is my pleasure to introduce Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Joseph Shiva, and Sharon Jewish Law at the Aliyah.
Good evening. Tonight we'll begin a three-part series on Jewish identity. It's a series that will tackle some of the most divisive and unresolved issues in today's Jewish community. Who is a Jew? What is the essence of Judaism? How is Jewishness determined in families of mixed heritage? Can a person leave Judaism? How does the status of converts to Judaism compare to those who are born as Jews? Must Judaism be an exclusive identity? When can it blend with other identities, and when can it not? All of these questions are on the table at this particular moment in history because of the distinctive reality in which we live. Jews in America live modern, autonomous lives outside of the sphere of coercive rabbinic power, and they therefore make their own normative choices about how to live Jewishly. Jews in America live in an environment devoid of any significant anti-Semitism. Jews in America are integrated into the general society in a way virtually unparalleled in Jewish history. Even the sort of social anti-Semitism that kept Jews out of various clubs and associations is dead. And Jews, even outwardly observant ones, can truly function like any other citizen in American society. And furthermore, the advent of a truly multicultural society, most powerfully cemented with President Obama's election, has led some scholars to begin speaking of an age of post-ethnicity, one that rejects, quote, the idea that descent is destiny. The role of origins and heritage has become increasingly elective, not only for Jews, but for all Americans. Now, all of these factors mean that there's no longer any perimeter around Jewish life and Jewish identity. There's no external force that defines who Jews are and who they ought to be. Almost everything is possible. In this world, the definitions must come solely from values within Judaism, if they are to come from anywhere. And so it becomes the task of our generation not merely to be responsive to phenomena playing out on the margins of some inertial sense of Jewish identity, but to formulate our own positive definitions of that identity. Those definitions must honestly confront present realities and strive to rise up and meet them with the rich language of our Jewish past. We turn to the first part of that task this evening. V'hakimoti et briti beini uveinecha uvein zaracha acharecha ledorotam livrit olam lishyot lecha leElohim ulezaracha acharecha v'natati lecha ulezaracha acharecha eit eretz megurecha eit kol eretz kenaan la'achuzat olam v'hayiti lahem leElohim. This source is not on your sheets. I will maintain my covenant, God says to Abraham, between us and your seed who will follow you for all generations as an eternal covenant, to be your God and the God of your seed who will follow you. I give to you and to your seed who will follow you the land you are living in, all the land of Canaan as an eternal possession, and I will be their God. And now from Deuteronomy, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem, Rashechem, Shiftechem, Ziknechem, Veshotrechem, Kol ish Yisrael, Tapchem, Neshechem, Vegercha, Asher bekerev machanecha, Mechotei veitzecha, Ad shoev meimecha, Ve'ovrecha bivrit Adonai Elohecha uve'alato, Asher Adonai Elohecha koret imcha hayom. Lema'an hakim otcha hayom lo le'am, Vehu yihyeh lecha le'Elohim ka'asher diber lach, Ve'ka'asher nishba la'avotecha la'Avraham li'Yitzchak u'li'Yaakov. Ve'lo itchem levadchem, אנוכי כורת את הברית הזאת ואת העלה הזאת, כי את אשר ישנו פה עמנו עומד היום לפני אדוני אלוהינו, ואת אשר איננו פה עמנו היום. You stand here today before Adonai your God to enter into a covenant with Adonai your God, in order to maintain you as God's nation, as God will be your God, as has been told to you and as was promised to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Yitzchak, and to Yaakov. But it is not only with you that I make this covenant, but with both those who are standing here with us today in the presence of Adonai our God, along with those who are not here with us today. Most Jews are made the old-fashioned way. They are born. Being a Jew by blood, or by seed in biblical and rabbinic idiom, has always been the dominant way of thinking about Jewish identity. To be Jewish is to be part of a family, a clan, a tribe, a nation. It's to be a descendant of Abraham and a descendant of his descendants, the Israelites who stood as a nation in the plains of Moab and heard the terms of the covenant renewed. And the parties to these covenants and affirmations are not only the individuals that willingly entered into them, but all the blood relatives that emerge from them until the end of time. Abraham's relationship with God forges not only his identity and spiritual journey, but the identity of an entire nation. Like royalty that lays claim to the throne on account of ancestry, like Kohanim who are priests by virtue of their parents' priestly prerogatives, most Jews are Jews because their parents were Jews. Now, before we begin to dissect the particulars of this system of being a Jew by blood, it's important to remember that it did not have to be so, and therefore it's worthwhile to pause to ask why it is so. Put most directly, why, according to Jewish tradition, did God enter into a relationship with a people, a nation that shares ties of blood? Why not elect Abraham and all those who follow in his religious path, irrespective of the question of descent? Why has Jewishness always been so wrapped up in peoplehood? Michael Wishograd, a contemporary Jewish philosopher, has asked these questions most pointedly in his central work, The Body of Faith. And here, at some length, are some of his questions and answers. Why a covenant with the carnal instead of the spiritual seed of Abraham? Is it physical relationship that is essential? Are there not those who are Abraham's children in the spirit, who are more dear to God than a crass, perhaps unbelieving Jew, who is related to Abraham in the flesh, but whose spiritual illumination is quite dim? Are not the real elect the aristocrats of the spirit who derive from all people, cultures, and races? The difficulty with the spiritualization of the God-man relationship, he writes, is that it is untrue to man's nature, which is largely carnal. The division of man into the spiritual and the material is itself an act of abstraction that has a limited validity, but that must not obscure the basic unity of human existence. Man is not a coupling of a spiritual and a material, but a creature who thinks and runs, grieves and cries, is amused and laughs. The God of Israel confirms man as he created him to live in the material cosmos. There is therefore no possibility of a divine requirement for the discarding of a part of human existence. And that is why God's election is of a carnal people. By electing the seed of Abraham, God creates a people that is in his service in the totality of its human being, and not just in its moral and spiritual existence. The domain of the family, the most fundamental and intimate human association, is thereby sanctified, so that obedience to God does not require hate of father and mother. Wishograd has more to say here, not just about families, but about nations. He argues that a God who cares about history must embrace nationality and peoplehood, since it is they that are the main drivers of human affairs. The national election of Israel thus affirms humanity's role in politics and God's investment in the actions of states. Wishograd argues the election of the Jewish people simultaneously confers legitimacy and relevance on the national order of all of humanity, and that leads in turn to the possibility that the historical order can be redeemed. Now, a post-nationalist conception of human society presents some serious challenges to Wishograd, as does the institution of conversion, which we will focus on more deeply next week. But his points on the centrality of families in human life remain highly relevant. Indeed, another aspect of blood-based Judaism requires emphasis. If Judaism seeks to emphasize the nature of a binding, enduring, inescapable covenantal relationship with God, it is hard to think of a better basis for Jewishness than familial descent. Families are distinctive in their unchosen and non-negotiable nature. Brothers and sisters share kinship even if they share no ideology. Fathers and mothers see themselves in their children's faces and personalities, even in the most painful and divisive arguments that transpire between them. Part of Judaism's dogged attachment to clan and tribe has surely been rooted in an understanding of God's relationship with Israel as eternal and unwavering as the familial structure in which it has been anchored. But even though these hereditary notions of identity are in some senses extremely stable and very predictable, there remains one core problem, which will be our focus this evening. Since it takes two members of the human species to produce any given offspring, how do we address the status of a child, one of whose parents belongs to the group and one of whose does not? If it is obvious that two Jewish parents create a Jew and two Gentile parents create a Gentile, what of the child of a Jew and a Gentile? Now, if we were concerned about blood alone, as tonight's conversation is, there are a number of possibilities for determining such a person's Jewish status. Model 1. Such a person is Jewish, independent of the gender of the Jewish parent, because anyone with at least one Jewish parent is Jewish. Model 2. If the person has a Jewish father, they are Jewish. If not, they are a Gentile. Model 3. If the person has a Jewish mother, they are Jewish. If not, they are a Gentile. Model 4. Such a person is a Gentile, because only someone with two Jewish parents is Jewish. And finally, Model 5. Such a person is a half-Jew, reflecting their mixed ancestry. Model 1, either parent sufficing, has never been the metric of Jewish identity in the past, as we shall see. Model 2, patrilineality, is the most straightforward reading of the Bible. Model 3, matrilineality, is the conventional view of rabbinic halacha. Model 4, requiring both parents to be Jewish, is a position attested in both medieval and modern halachic literature. And Model 5, while never articulated as such in halachic language, the concept of a half-Jew, may be the most honest representation of both the sum total of halachic insight on this topic and the way contemporary people of mixed heritage actually experience themselves. So let's begin at the beginning and try to sort out the history of the laws of Jewish descent. There is no indication anywhere in the Bible that having a non-Israelite mother renders one a non-Israelite. Right? Plain and simple. Moreover, there are clear indications to the contrary, not just with respect to a typical Gentile, but even with respect to Gentile women from nations that the Torah specifically singles out to be distanced from the Israelite nation. Yehuda's son Shelah, listed among the 70 people who make up the core of Israelites who go down to Egypt, is the daughter of a Canaanite woman. Ephraim and Menashe, who take their place as two of the 12 tribes of Israel, are the children of an Egyptian woman, herself the daughter of an idolatrous priest. Moshe's children's mother, Tzipporah, comes from Midian. Boaz marries Ruth of Moab, and she is the ancestor of the Davidic line. In fact, the one place where the Torah explicitly forbids intermarriage seems to affirm the patrilineal pattern. We read in the source you now have in front of you in Dvarim chapter 7. When Adonai your God brings you to the land that you are entering to possess, and dislodges great nations before you, and Adonai your God gives them before you, and you strike them down, you are not to marry them. Your daughter you are not to give to his son. His daughter you are not to take for your son, for he would turn aside your son from following after me, and they would serve other gods. The syntax of the verse here is fairly clear. Do not intermarry with these indigenous nations. Do not give your daughter in marriage to a native son, and do not take a native's daughter as a wife for your son. For he, your Canaanite in-law, will turn your son away from me and lead him to worship other gods. In other words, even though your daughter-in-law will technically be absorbed into your clan, and her children will be Israelites, in keeping with a patriarchal model, her indigenous religion remains a threat to you. Do not be deceived, warns the Torah, by a patrilineal system that rules that this son of yours will produce you Israelite grandchildren, because this son is in fact in cultural religious peril and threatens to become an idolater of Israelite stock. And so, while there are some indications that the child of a foreign woman and an Israelite man bore some stigma, there is the case of Shimon's son, Shaul ben Hakna'anit, flagged as such, there is no indication that such a child is not an Israelite. Now, with respect to the offspring of Israelite women and foreign men, we have one prominent example located in this week's Torah reading. Always comes back to the weekly portion, right? And the indication of patrilineality is quite strong here as well. Vayikra chapter 24. Now the son of an Israelite woman went out. He was also the son of an Egyptian man amid the children of Israel, and they scuffled in the camp, the son of the Israelite woman and an Israelite man. Whatever the status of this son of an Israelite woman, he is not an Israelite, in contrast to the man he fights with. Lacking an Israelite father is an obstacle to being a full Israelite, perhaps to being an Israelite at all. Indeed, in most cases, such a person would have been lost to Israelite society, going off to live with his mother in his father's foreign clan. But even in the odd case where he's present, like the case of this Egyptian father who fled along with the Israelites, his father's outsider status prevented him from being a full member of the group. This point is underscored later on in the passage when verse 16 asserts that anyone who blasphemes God's name must be stoned, whether a citizen or a ger, a resident alien, which is a seeming reference to our matrilineal protagonist, who is not a full citizen, but a ger. The first inkling we get of any sort of matrilineal approach is in the book of Ezra, where a figure known as Shchania ben Yechiel proposes to Ezra that all of the returning exiles who have taken foreign wives cast away those wives and their children, v'hanolad mehem, causing them to leave the community. Now, the need for that edict, for that policy proposal, only underscores that these people would, by default prior to that proposal, have been considered part of the Israelite community, in keeping with the broader patrilineal background in the Bible. It could also well be that Shchania would have been in favor of expelling the Gentile husbands of Israelite women. It was just that no such women could be found in the patriarchal context of the time, because those women would have remained behind with their husbands in Babylonia. But this measure, even if it has little legal significance, does seem to mark the beginning of a policy treating the children of Gentile women as Gentiles, even if only as a matter of social stigma and not yet as a matter of religious law. Now, as with many issues, somewhere between biblical and rabbinic literature, something changes, and new assumptions begin to guide religious thinking on this issue, starting with the Mishnah and moving forward. It's beyond the scope of this lecture to go deeply into that transition. Those who are interested should read Shia Cohen's book, The Beginnings of Jewishness, for a fuller scholarly account that is in fact very readable. Whether for reasons of internal or external influence, and Cohen explores both, the old patrilineal rule is no longer the bedrock principle in foundational rabbinic texts. While Jewish priestly descent, the Keuna, continued and continues to be reckoned patrilineally, the Jewish status of a child of mixed heritage became more complicated. So let's begin with what rabbinic texts have to say about a Jewish father and a Gentile mother. Mishnah Kiddushin 3:12 issues a clear, unambiguous ruling. The child of a Gentile mother is a Gentile. Rabbi Yochanan, somewhat later, attempts to ground this text back in Scripture into the verse that we just read in Dvarim, which I argued cuts in the opposite direction. And this ruling and interpretation seem to have met with some popular resistance even a few centuries later. There's an amazing story which you have in full in front of you, reported in the Talmud Yerushalmi and various other midrashim from the land of Israel, which tell of some in the community of Tyre wanting to circumcise patrilineal children on Shabbat, revealing their sense that such children ought to have been a full part of the Jewish community. When a local Jewish non-rabbinic leader comes to their defense, a Yaakov of Kvar Naburaya, invoking the biblical model, saying, hey, the Bible follows a patrilineal rule, he is forcefully and unequivocally silenced by Rabbi Chagai. And since that text and that time, until the modern period, we have no evidence of any rabbinic authority challenging this rule. While Karaites maintain a patrilineal system until this day, rabbinic Jews since the time of the Mishnah formally declared the children of Gentile women to be Gentiles. And yet, that formal declaration has not told the entire story. Modern rabbis, including Rav Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer and Rav Ben Zion Uziel, have argued, based on a close reading of a number of Talmudic passages, for the classification of those with patrilineal Jewish roots as Zera Yisrael, still possessed of Jewish stock. And the teachings of Rav Uziel, who was the first Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, are particularly significant in this regard. As you know, part of the culture of conversion to Judaism is the initial dissuading of the potential convert. Rav Uziel rules quite clearly that when a person of patrilineal Jewish descent approaches the conversion process, in keeping with the Mishnah's implicit requirement in this regard, that such a person must convert, they must be enthusiastically accepted by the court. After all, says Rav Uziel, the process we know as conversion is properly described in this case, in fact, as chozer hayeled leikar zar'o, one in which the person unambiguously claims roots that are already theirs. In other words, says Rav Uziel, while conversion is still required, these authorities understand that the process is metaphysically different from that of a Gentile coming to Judaism without any genetic connection. And what are the consequences of looking at it that way, other than just language? Well, it means that once the person has gone through the conversion process, they're not considered a convert. Okay? If I'm essentially returning to roots I already had, this process just retroactively affirms the Jewishness that I had latent within me from the start. Remember, for further consequences in this regard, that the black letter law laid out in the Shulchan Aruch states that a female convert to Judaism may not marry a Kohen, a Jew of priestly descent. Some of you have heard me discuss that law at greater depths in other contexts, and we won't do that here. Rav Uziel specifically considers the case of a woman with a Jewish father who went through a conversion. And he asks, does this law banning her from marrying a Kohen apply to her? And in keeping with his approach and his theory, Rav Uziel writes a tshuva in 1940 stating that it does not. He writes that while the child of a Gentile woman requires conversion, after this process her father's Jewish lineage comes to the fore and renders her Zera Yisrael for the purposes of marriage to a Kohen. Now, I don't want to mislead you. Rav Uziel's approach was not and is not universally accepted. Rav Herzog, who was the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel at the time of the founding of the state, also considered a similar case, and he forbade the marriage. And it's clear that he and others treat the conversion of patrilineals no differently than that of Gentiles. But aside from Rav Uziel's stature, which makes his ruling significant in its own right, his rulings are a critical illustration of the possibility of accepting the Mishnah's ruling regarding the children of Jewish men and Gentile women without having to equate such children to Gentiles in all respects. Let's shift now to the case of a Jewish mother and a Gentile father. Here, classic rabbinic sources are divided, and a debate persists for centuries longer than the flip side of this equation feature. Some sources, including Mishnah Yevamot, chapter 7, Mishnah 5, argue that such a child, a matrilineal Jew, is a mamzer, a Jew, fully obligated in mitzvot, but forbidden from marrying Jews of untainted lineage. Others, such as Rabbi Shimon's view in Tosefta Kiddushin, chapter 4, reject the taint of mamzerut in this case, while either lowering the level of lineal taint, so they might say this person can marry garden variety Jews, but not Kohanim, not those of priestly descent, or some claiming that no taint exists whatsoever. In the Babylonian Talmud, there's a clear, discernible process whereby the Mishnah's determination that this child is a mamzer is gradually undermined, and he is instead assigned the status of kasher, valid, free of taint. But even after the transition from mamzer to kasher, the road is not smooth. And so turn to the source, the Babylonian Talmud, Yevamot 45a, where we find the following selection of stories. This is on the third page of sources in front of you, towards the bottom of that page, where I have bolded, beginning with the words Aman. A man came to Rav and asked, "What is the status of the child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother?" He said to him, "The child is kasher." Page 3 of sources, page 4 of the packet. Bottom, a man came to Rav and asked. Yevamot 44a to 45b. Not there? Left out of the Xerox? Why don't you run off just the packet again? I'll do a dramatic reading and you'll follow. A man came to Rav and asked, "What is the status of the child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother?" He said to him, "The child is kasher, valid." He said to him, "Let me marry your daughter." He was asking a question about himself. "I will not." Said Shimi Bar Chia to Rav, "As the saying goes, a camel in Medea can dance in a tiny space. Here's the space, here's the camel, here is Medea, and yet no dancing." He said to him, even if he were like Yehoshua bin Nun, I would not give him my daughter. The man said to Rav Shimi Bar Chia said to Rav, "If he were like Yehoshua bin Nun, someone else would marry him. In this case, if your daughter doesn't marry him, no one will." The son of the Gentile would not leave. Rav looked at him, and he died. A similar case, it doesn't say who died, but we have to assume here it's the man, not Rav. A similar case came to Rav Yehuda. Another man of such descent came to him. Rav Yehuda said, "Go disappear, or marry your own kind," another child of a Gentile father and a Jewish mother. When a similar case came to Rava, he said, "Go into exile, or marry your own kind." Now these stories, at once comic, haunting, and deeply upsetting, highlight the residual resistance both within the Jewish community and at the highest levels of rabbinic authority to accepting matrilineal Jews as full members of the Jewish community. While formally mouthing the word kasher, these rabbis essentially condemn the individuals to the life of the mamzer, destined to marry their own kind, and forced to stay away from the rest of the Jewish community. The latest layers of the Talmud Bavli, however, do reject mamzerut for matrilineal Jews and seem to embrace them as full Jews, possibly with restrictions on marrying a Kohen, and so the matter is codified in the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century. That's how we get to the notion of there being a matrilineal principle at all. If I combine Mishnah Kiddushin, the Gentile mother produces Gentile children, with the latest layer of the Babylonian Talmud, which seems to come around to Jewish mothers producing Jewish children, we can get a simplified picture of the rule being matrilineal. But there's a strand less embracing of the matrilineal Jew that survived. Piskei Tosafot, a digest of the legal decisions buried in the dialectical creativity of the French and German Tosafists of the medieval period, records a view that understands the word kasher in the Talmud only as a rejection of the indelible mark of mamzerut, which can never be erased. But the child, though free of this lineal taint, is, according to this view, a Gentile in need of conversion. And a number of Tosafistic sources corroborate this thinking. And even the dominance of the Shulchan Aruch with its ruling did not shut down this approach. It's a remarkable responsum of Rav Shlomo Kluger in 19th century Poland, who was asked if it's permissible to allow a Jewish woman who gave birth to the child of a Gentile man to name that child in the synagogue on Shabbat. 19th century Poland, okay? Not, 13th century Mallorca, all right? We're talking the heart of the Jewish halacha conversation in modernity. He writes, obviously, if a male Jew marries a Gentile woman, the offspring follows her Gentile status. But even if it is the reverse situation, and a Gentile man marries a Jewish woman, in which case the child follows her status, as is explicit in the Talmud and later decisors, nonetheless, God forbid that one should give that child a Jewish name. Chazal's intention in saying that the child is kasher is simply to convey that it is not a mamzer, but it still requires conversion. Rav Kluger's contemporary, Rav Yaakov Lorbeerbaum, ruled similarly and explained, similar to the passage in Rav Uziel above, that the conversion required here is different from most conversions. Here too, once the person of matrilineal descent has converted, it is as if they did not convert at all, because they have merely clarified their unambiguous attachment to a heritage that was already theirs. Now, I don't want to mislead you here either. Most authorities chronologically following Rav Lorbeerbaum and Rav Kluger rejected their requirement of conversion and stated simply that matrilineal Jews were full Jews. But even here, one must be cautious and read between the lines. As we already saw in the Talmud, ruling that someone is kasher de jure hardly necessitates actualizing that ruling de facto. And a case in point is a responsum by Rav Moshe Feinstein in 1956, when he is asked about allowing a bar mitzvah boy with a Gentile father to have an Aliyah. Responsa Igrot Moshe on the sheets in front of you. Even though it is obvious that this boy has the status of a Jew in all respects, at least according to the majority of medieval authorities whose opinion we follow, and therefore, says Rabbi Feinstein, there is a corollary obligation to teach him Torah and mitzvot. In practice, if the mother is still living with the Gentile father and is not observant, one should create as many obstacles as possible to prevent him from being called to the Torah for his bar mitzvah and to prevent them from having a celebration in the synagogue. And it would be a good idea to prevent him from learning in the Hebrew school as well. Only if the mother separates from the Gentile father should one teach him and give him an aliyah and have a bar mitzvah celebration. This sounds to me like a moderated version of go into exile or marry your own kind. Suffice it to say, it's overly simplistic to paint the history of matrilineal Jews as uncomplicated, whether as a matter of fact or even as a matter of law. And perhaps in this respect and others, patrilineal and matrilineal Jews have more in common than we might have previously thought. Now, having surveyed the historical and halachic data, how do we proceed? How do we frame this conversation and actually think practically about it going forward? To my mind, there are three ground rules that ought to frame our communal conversation about Jewishness by descent going forward. First, Judaism is a religion of the body, not just the mind. And therefore, questions of identity are wrapped up not just in questions of commitment and mission, but also in descent and bloodline. Any approach to Jewish identity that ignores this, by, for instance, blindly accepting anyone who self-describes as a Jew, irrespective of questions of descent, is not seriously engaging with an essential element of what it has always meant to be Jewish, namely belonging to the Jewish people. Second, we should be committed to engaging with the Jewish discourse of the ages and being in continuous conversation with that normative past. One can, of course, choose not to engage with prior sources and to come up with new definitions of Jewish identity without making an effort to tether them to earlier stages of the conversation. That, however, steps outside of the covenantal conversation of Torah and is as such a deep breach of any serious religious connection to the past. And on a utilitarian plane, it deprives contemporary Jews of an authentic expression of Jewish identity that can connect them with their past rather than sever them from it. Third, a healthy Jewish discourse on dissent should be honest and transparent, and one should be able to articulate it without either feeling embarrassed or resorting to authoritarian conversation stoppers. It should make sense even to one who embraces a different vision of Jewish dissent. As we've seen this evening, any approach to Jewish dissent that claims that the matrilineal principle, as commonly understood today, mothers determine everything about a Jew's identity, has always been a fundamental truth of Jewish life. Anyone that claims that is historically blind and halakhically inauthentic. And any statement that claims that to sum up Jewish identity on the ground today, that one can sum that up by saying that it simply follows one's mother, is willfully ignorant of contemporary conditions. I want to turn to each one of those factors now in somewhat greater depth. Judaism is a religion of the body. Jewish practice is and always has been grounded in physical acts, concrete expressions of values that fill a Jew's life. For all that faith and dogma have also been a part of Judaism, it is undeniable that one of the most distinctive elements of Judaism, and one of the things that often most attracts outsiders to it, is its earthy and physical quality. This is a religious system that features, among other things, leather boxes containing the words of the Torah to be strapped on the arm and the head, the consumption of ritual foods on Shabbat and Chagim, on the holidays, the construction of a temporary home during Sukkot, and the deep valuing of marital intimacy as one of the holy expressions of our humanity. It's therefore no surprise that conversion to Judaism requires a physical act. Could one imagine that Judaism would be a religion of the body everywhere but with respect to Jewish identity? Either a person is born with a Jewish body by having Jewish parents, or the body must be made Jewish by immersing in water, and in the case of men, through circumcision. Despite all the debates throughout Jewish history regarding conversion, no rabbinic source ever suffices with an oath of allegiance or the adoption of Jewish practices to turn someone of Gentile parentage into a Jew. Even a child adopted as a baby by two Jewish parents who will never have a conscious Gentile moment in their life undergoes immersion in a mikvah as a reflection of this emphasis on bodily Jewishness. And in fact, Paul's break from Judaism stemmed in part from his reimagination of a covenant with God that could be affirmed without a bodily component. Unlike Christianity, Islam, and other religions that can suffice with declarations of faith and commitment, conversion to Judaism requires not only verbally and emotionally signing on to the Jewish people and the Jewish mission, but also a physical act that concretizes this commitment. Now, confronting that truth carries with it a corollary. The Jewish identity of those with one Jewish parent and one Gentile parent is bound to be complex. On the one hand, a person with one Jewish parent is of Jewish genetic stock and has a bloodline with Jewish roots. On the other hand, such a person is clearly not as unambiguously Jewish on the bodily plane as someone with two Jewish parents. The question of how to address the case of mixed ancestry is therefore complicated in any tradition that takes peoplehood seriously as a category above and beyond the category